9 climbers left base camp on July 14, 2006. By sunrise on July 16, only 3 were still breathing. The weather was perfect. The skies were clear. There wasn't a single cloud between Pakistan and China. Not one gust of wind disturbed the fixed ropes. Every forecast said the same thing. This was the summit window climbers wait years for. The kind of conditions that happen maybe once a decade. The kind of day when reaching the top should have been a certainty, not a death sentence. And that's exactly what made it lethal. What happened on Gasherbrum 2 in July 2006 wasn't a tragedy caused by avalanche, rockfall, or sudden storms. It wasn't bad luck or equipment failure. It was something far more preventable, far more disturbing, and far more common than the climbing industry wants you to know. 6 people froze to death in clear weather, not because they couldn't move, but because they weren't allowed to. They died standing in line, waiting, for hours. On a narrow ridge, at 700-800 meters, where human beings can only survive for minutes without supplemental oxygen. And Gasherbrum 2 is climbed without oxygen. This is the full story, the one that expedition companies have spent 18 years trying to bury. The decisions that killed 9 people, the warnings that were ignored. The moment when a traffic jam at 26,000 feet became a mass grave in slow motion, and the question that still haunts every survivor: who was really responsible? If you followed this channel, you know we don't tell the sanitized version. We don't protect reputations. We name the dead, we name the decisions, and we name the people who walked away when others were dying. That's what you're about to get. The complete account of the deadliest day in Gasherbrum 2's history. If that's the kind of deep dive documentary you want more of, hit subscribe right now. We publish these investigations regularly, and the algorithm only shows them to people who've subscribed. Don't miss the next one. Now, let me tell you who died. Peter Vanderberg was 40 years old, Dutch. A successful civil engineer from Rotterdam who had spent 15 years methodically working his way up the list of the world's highest peaks. He'd summited Broad Peak the previous year. He'd climbed in the Alps, the Andes, the Himalayas. His wife, Marieke, was pregnant with their second child when he left for Pakistan in June 2006. She didn't want him to go. She told him that in a letter she'd written and hidden in his duffel bag, which he found at base camp. He called her from a satellite phone that night and promised her that he would be careful. Peter died standing in a line of climbers that hadn't moved in 4 hours. He was still clipped to the fixed rope. His body temperature dropped below what his cells could sustain. His blood thickened. His heart stopped. All while other climbers pushed past him, stepping over his body to reach the summit. Marieke gave birth to their daughter 8 weeks later. She named her Pieter. Kazuki Tanaka was 34, Japanese. A photographer who specialized in high-altitude imagery and had published work in National Geographic and several Japanese adventure magazines. He joined a commercial expedition with the promise of capturing the sunrise from the summit, a shot he believed would define his career. His camera was found still attached to his frozen body, lens cap off, frame counter showing he'd taken no photographs that day. He never reached a vantage point worth shooting. Kazuki died in the queue behind Peter. Witnesses say he was still conscious when Peter stopped moving in front of him. He didn't have the strength to unclip from the rope and go around. He didn't have the energy to descend. He sat down in the snow, closed his eyes, and never opened them again. His family in Osaka received his body 3 months later. His camera was returned with the film still inside. When they developed it, the last photograph was a shot of base camp at sunrise. Beautiful, hopeful, taken the morning he started his summit push. He never took another. Amelia Reyes was 29. Spanish. The youngest member of a private expedition organized by a Madrid-based climbing club. She was an architect. She was engaged. She was attempting to become the youngest Spanish woman to summit an 8,000-meter peak. Her fiancé Carlos had proposed at the Annapurna base camp 2 years earlier during a trekking trip that sparked her obsession with high altitude. Amelia made it to the summit. She was one of 13 climbers who actually reached the top that day. She signed her name in the summit log at 4:47 p.m., dangerously late, but still alive. Her descent took 7 hours. She died 200 meters from Camp 4 within sight of the tents, within earshot of other climbers. No one came out to help her. Her body was recovered 11 days later. She was still wearing her engagement ring. The climbing community called the 2006 season on Gasherbrum 2 perfect. The word appeared in expedition reports, weather bulletins, and promotional materials. Perfect conditions. Perfect weather window. Perfect opportunity. What they didn't say, what they've never publicly admitted, is that perfect conditions created a scenario where more than 200 climbers from over 30 expeditions attempted the summit within the same 72-hour window. And the mountain has one route, one fixed line, one narrow section at 600 meters where only a single climber can pass at a time. That section is called the Banana Ridge. It's a 90-minute traverse in good conditions with no traffic. On July 15, 2006, it took some climbers more than 6 hours to get through. 6 hours, at an altitude where every minute drains your oxygen reserves, where your body is consuming itself for warmth, where a delay of 30 minutes can be the difference between summiting and dying. Those who survived describe it the same way, standing still, watching their oxygen dwindle, watching climbers ahead of them collapse, knowing that if they stayed much longer, they would collapse too, but unable to move because there was simply nowhere to go. This wasn't bad luck. This was predictable, this was preventable, and some people saw it coming. Reinhard Koch was a German expedition leader with over 20 years of experience in the Karakoram. He'd been to Gasherbrum 2-3 times before 2006. When he arrived at base camp that June and saw the number of tents already there, more than he'd ever seen on any 8,000-meter peak in Pakistan, he sent a message to his clients back in Munich. He told them he was considering canceling the expedition entirely. He told them the mountain was too crowded. He told them someone was going to die. His clients accused him of being overcautious. One threatened to sue if the expedition was called off. Another said Koch had lost his nerve. Koch climbed anyway. He reached the summit on July 15th at 1:30 p.m. early because he'd started at midnight instead of the standard 3 a.m. that most teams used. He passed the bottleneck before it became lethal. He descended while others were still ascending. On his way down, he counted 17 climbers stopped on the Banana Ridge. Some were moving. Some were sitting. Some were not moving at all. He didn't stop to help any of them. He later said he didn't have the oxygen reserves to do anything except save himself. Reinhard Koch is still climbing. He's never spoken publicly about what he saw that day. But a recording of his satellite phone call to base camp that afternoon was leaked to a German mountaineering magazine in 2011. On that recording, his voice breaks when he says, "There are bodies on the ridge. Multiple bodies. And people are stepping over them to continue up." That recording is the clearest evidence we have of what happened during those 6 hours when the bottleneck became a morgue. Now, you're probably wondering how this could happen. How could more than 200 climbers attempt the same route on the same day? How could expedition companies allow a traffic jam to form at 600 meters? How could experienced mountaineers watch other climbers dying in front of them and continue toward the summit instead of helping? The answers to those questions are not simple. They involve money, ego, permit systems designed to maximize revenue rather than safety, and a culture within commercial mountaineering that prioritizes summit success rates over everything else, including human life. Over the next 90 minutes, I'm going to take you through every decision that led to this disaster. You'll hear from survivors, families, and industry insiders who've never spoken publicly until now. You'll learn what the expedition companies knew and when they knew it. You'll understand exactly who died, how they died, and who could have saved them but chose not to. This is the kind of investigation that takes months to research and hours to present. If you find value in this work, if you want to see more documentaries that go this deep and hold the climbing industry accountable, subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications, share this video. The only way these stories get told is if enough people watch them to justify the work. But the real question, the one that's going to follow you for the rest of this documentary, is this. If the conditions were perfect, if the weather was clear, if the forecasts were accurate, and if every climber on that mountain was experienced enough to know better, then why did 9 people die? The answer starts with a decision made weeks before anyone left base camp. A decision about money. A decision about permits. A decision that packed more climbers onto a single route than the mountain could possibly sustain. To understand how that decision killed 9 people, we need to go back to March 2006, 4 months before the first body fell, to a government office in Islamabad where the season's permits were being approved. That's where this disaster really began. Chapter 2: The Victims Before the Mountain. Before March 2006, the Ministry of Tourism in Islamabad had never approved more than 100 climbers for a single peak in a single season. The previous record on Gasherbrum 2 was 87 permits issued in 2004, already considered dangerously high by many expedition leaders who'd climbed there that year. But 2006 was different. The Pakistani government had been aggressively marketing its 8,000-meter peaks to international climbers since 2001. The revenue potential was enormous. Each permit cost between $3,000 and $7,000 depending on expedition size, plus mandatory liaison officers, environmental fees, and rescue bonds. A single climbing season could generate more revenue for the Gilgit-Baltistan region than the entire annual tourism budget of smaller Pakistani provinces. So when applications started arriving for the summer 2006 season, more applications than anyone had ever seen, the ministry approved them all, 219 permits for Gasherbrum 2 alone, plus another 63 for Gasherbrum I next door, plus 41 for Broad Peak. More than 300 climbers converging on the same base camp, the same approach route, and the same weather window. The expedition companies knew. The Pakistani Alpine Club knew. The liaison officers assigned to each team knew. Everyone who looked at the permit lists in April 2006 knew that something unprecedented was about to happen. And nobody said anything. Because saying something would mean losing clients, losing revenue, losing competitive advantage against companies that were willing to stay quiet. The climbers themselves? Most of them had no idea. They'd paid between $8,000 and $25,000 for their spots on commercial expeditions. They'd trained for months. They'd arranged leave from their jobs, said goodbye to their families, and traveled halfway around the world with the understanding that their expedition leaders had done the due diligence. They trusted the system. The system betrayed them. Let me tell you about 5 of the people who died because of that betrayal. Because if you're going to understand this disaster, you need to understand who these people were. Not statistics, not numbers and a death toll. Human beings with families, dreams, and futures that were stolen from them. Henrik Larsson was 47, Swedish. A maritime engineer who worked on cargo ships crossing the Baltic. He'd been climbing for 23 years, ever since a friend took him to the Swedish mountains in 1983. By 2006, he'd summited 5 of the 14 8,000-meter peaks. Gasherbrum 2 would have been number 6. Henrik's wife, Ingrid, had stopped supporting his expeditions after 2003, when he'd nearly died from pulmonary edema on Cho-Oyu. She told him he was too old for this. She told him he had 2 teenage sons who needed their father alive. She told him she wouldn't be there when he got back if he kept taking these risks. Henrik went anyway. He told Ingrid that Gasherbrum 2 was one of the easier 8,000ers, technically straightforward, well-established route, minimal objective danger. He promised this would be his last expedition. He promised he'd be careful. The last text message Ingrid received from Henrik was sent at 2:17 a.m. on July 15th, just before he left Camp 4 for his summit push. It said, "Weather is perfect. I'll be home in 2 weeks. I love you." Henrik died at approximately 3:30 p.m. that afternoon. He'd been stuck in the bottleneck for more than 4 hours when his body simply gave out. Other climbers described watching him sway, stumble, and fall forward onto the fixed rope. He didn't move again. His body was recovered the following season. Ingrid had him cremated and scattered his ashes in the Baltic, where he'd spent most of his working life. She never remarried. She told a Swedish documentary crew in 2019 that she still dreams about him sometimes. In the dreams, he's always coming home. If you've lost someone, or if you just understand the weight of these stories, you'll get why we take the time to tell them properly. This channel is built on that commitment. Subscribe if you want more documentaries that honor the dead while exposing the failures that killed them. We don't rush. We don't sensationalize. We investigate. Now, back to the victims. Marco Benedetti was 36, Italian. A financial consultant from Milan who'd started climbing in his late 20s after a divorce. left him searching for purpose. He'd described mountaineering to friends as the only place where life makes sense, a sentiment that's either profoundly spiritual or deeply concerning depending on how you interpret it. Marco had joined an Italian expedition led by a well-known guide named Franco Cavalli, a man with 12 8,000-meter summits who'd been featured in Italian climbing magazines for over a decade. Cavalli charged premium prices and promised premium results. His success rate on guided expeditions was above 80%, a number he advertised aggressively and defended fiercely. What Cavalli didn't advertise was his strategy for maintaining that success rate. He pushed clients beyond their limits. He departed for summits in marginal conditions. He minimized rest days. He gambled with weather windows that other expedition leaders considered too risky. In 2006, Cavalli's gamble was departing for the summit at the same time as every other expedition on the mountain, knowing full well that delays were inevitable, but calculating that his clients would power through. Marco didn't power through. He reached the bottleneck at 11 a.m., hours behind Cavalli's planned schedule. He waited, and waited, and waited. At 2 p.m., he radioed base camp to say he was turning back, that he couldn't feel his fingers or his toes, and that he didn't think he could make it to the summit and back alive. Cavalli, who had already summited and was descending a different section of the route, radioed back and told Marco to continue. "You're so close," Cavalli said. "Push through. This is why you came here." Marco pushed through. He reached the summit at 5:15 p.m., the last climber to sign the summit log that day. He never made it back down. His body was found the next morning, less than 500 meters from Camp 4, frozen in a position that suggested he'd sat down to rest and never gotten back up. Franco Cavalli still runs guided expeditions. He's never publicly acknowledged any responsibility for Marco's death. When an Italian journalist asked him about it in 2018, Cavalli said, "Marco made his own choices. Every climber takes personal responsibility on the mountain." That quote appeared in Marco's mother's eulogy at his memorial service in Milan. She read it aloud to the congregation and then said, "My son trusted a man who left him to die. I hope that man never has another peaceful night." She died in 2021. By all accounts, she never forgave Franco Cavalli. Neither has anyone who knows the full story. Let me tell you about the next victim, someone whose death exposes an even darker truth about what happened that day. Yuki Hasegawa was 31, Japanese. A nurse from Hokkaido who'd started climbing during university and quickly discovered she had natural talent at altitude. She acclimatized faster than most men. She moved efficiently on technical terrain. She'd summited 3 8,000-meter peaks by the time she arrived at Gasherbrum 2, Manaslu, Cho-Oyu, and Shishapangma, and she'd done all three without supplemental oxygen. Yuki wasn't on a guided expedition. She was climbing with a small team of independent Japanese climbers who shared expenses and made collective decisions about weather and logistics. They departed for the summit at 2 a.m. on July 15th, an hour earlier than most teams, hoping to avoid the traffic that they'd observed building throughout the previous week. It almost worked. Yuki and her two teammates reached the Banana Ridge before most other climbers had even left Camp 4. They moved quickly through the technical sections and were approaching the final summit push by 10 a.m. And then they ran into the traffic coming up. The fixed ropes on Gasherbrum 2 run in both directions. Climbers ascending and descending use the same lines. When traffic is light, passing is straightforward. When traffic is heavy, it becomes a nightmare. Someone has to unclip to let someone else pass. Someone has to step aside. Someone has to wait. By 10:30 a.m., Yuki's team was stuck behind a wall of ascending climbers, mostly from commercial expeditions, mostly moving slowly, mostly refusing to yield to faster climbers coming down. They waited for nearly 2 hours. During that time, Yuki's core body temperature began to drop. The human body at 700-800 meters is constantly hemorrhaging heat, and the only way to stay warm is to keep moving. Standing still is a death sentence measured in hours. At 12:30 p.m., Yuki's team made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. They stepped off the fixed rope and tried to bypass the traffic by traversing a section of unprotected snow slope to the side of the main route. Yuki went first. The snow held for 3 steps. On the 4th, the slope broke beneath her. She fell approximately 400 meters down the north face, tumbling over rocks and ice until her body came to rest on a glacier below the climbing route. Her teammates watched the entire fall. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't even scream. At that altitude, the body doesn't have enough oxygen to produce sound beyond a whisper. Yuki's body was never recovered. The glacier she fell onto is an active icefall. Her remains are presumably buried under tons of shifting ice, inaccessible and invisible. Her family in Japan held a funeral without a body. They placed a photograph of her on the mountain, taken the day before her death, in the memorial instead. Her teammates returned to Japan and disbanded their climbing group. One of them never climbed again. The other committed suicide in 2009. The note he left didn't mention Yuki by name, but his family said he'd never forgiven himself for surviving when she didn't. That's 2 deaths now that trace directly back to the traffic jam. One climber who froze waiting in line, and one who died trying to escape it. But the decisions that created that traffic jam were made months earlier, in permit offices and expedition company boardrooms, by people who knew exactly what they were setting in motion. The next victim's story makes that connection explicit. Sergei Volkov was 43, Russian. A Moscow-based businessman who'd made his fortune in post-Soviet aluminum trading and developed a passion for extreme sports in his late 30s. He'd climbed Elbrus, Aconcagua, and Denali before setting his sights on the 8,000-meter peaks. Gasherbrum, too, would have been his first. Sergei didn't join an expedition randomly. He did research. He compared companies. He evaluated safety records. He asked questions about guide ratios, oxygen protocols, and contingency planning. And he specifically chose an expedition that promised limited group size and personalized summit support. The expedition was run by a Kazakhstan-based company that had been operating in the Karakoram since 1998. Their marketing materials emphasized exclusivity and safety. Their website featured testimonials from satisfied clients who'd summited with minimal crowds and maximum support. What the website didn't mention was that the company had sold 12 spots on their expedition, twice their advertised capacity, and that half their clients were first-time high-altitude climbers who had no business being on an 8,000-meter peak. Sergei discovered this at base camp. He confronted the expedition leader, a man named Alexei Petrov, and demanded an explanation. Petrov told him the extra clients were experienced climbers who didn't require much support, and that their presence wouldn't affect Sergei's summit attempt. Sergei should have walked away. He'd paid $18,000 for his spot, and he could have demanded a refund based on the misrepresentation. Instead, he decided to trust Petrov. He decided to believe that his expedition leader knew what he was doing. On July 15th, Sergei departed for the summit with 11 other climbers from his expedition, all of them planning to reach the top within the same weather window, all of them using the same fixed ropes as every other expedition on the mountain. Sergei reached the bottleneck at approximately noon. He waited. He radioed Petrov at base camp and asked for guidance. Petrov told him to be patient. At 2 p.m., Sergei began to show signs of severe altitude sickness. Other climbers later reported that he was stumbling, slurring his words, and having difficulty clipping and unclipping from the fixed rope. His brain was swelling from lack of oxygen, a condition called high-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, and without immediate descent to lower altitude, it would kill him within hours. The climbers around Sergei could see what was happening. Some of them had medical training. All of them knew the symptoms. Not one of them stopped to help. Because stopping to help would mean losing their own summit window. It would mean watching other climbers pass them while they assisted someone who probably couldn't be saved anyway. It would mean sacrificing their $15,000 investment, their months of training, their once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So they kept climbing. They stepped around Sergei. They pretended not to see him swaying on the rope, and when he finally collapsed at approximately 3 p.m., they stepped over his body. Sergei Volkov died alone, surrounded by dozens of people who could have saved him but chose not to. His body remained on the mountain until 2008, when a Pakistani military expedition recovered several bodies as part of a cleanup operation. Sergei was identified by his passport, which was still in his summit suit pocket. His widow, Elena, received his personal effects 6 months later. Among them was a photograph of her and their 2 children that Sergei had planned to place on the summit. It was never placed anywhere. If these stories are affecting you, If you're starting to understand that mountain disasters aren't random tragedies but preventable failures, then you're exactly the audience we make these documentaries for. Subscribe. The algorithm doesn't promote content this long unless viewers actively follow the channel. If you want to see more investigations like this, you have to tell YouTube you want them. There's one more victim I need to tell you about before we move to the fatal decisions that killed them all, because her story reveals the final piece of this puzzle. Christine Müller was 38, German, an emergency room physician from Hamburg who'd started climbing as a form of therapy after burning out from the stress of her job. She described the mountains to colleagues as the only place where death isn't my responsibility, a statement that seems bitterly ironic given how she died. Christine was one of the most qualified climbers on Gasherbrum 2 that season. She'd summited 7 8,000-meter peaks. She'd been on 2 Everest expeditions. She'd written articles about altitude medicine for German climbing publications. She understood the risks better than almost anyone on the mountain. And she still died. Because individual competence means nothing when the system is designed to fail. Christine reached the bottleneck at 9 a.m., early because she'd started her summit push at midnight and moved faster than almost everyone else on the route. She was hours ahead of the traffic. She should have been clear, but the traffic was coming up behind her. And as she descended from the summit at 2 p.m., she ran directly into the mass of climbers still trying to ascend. For the next 3 hours, Christine was stuck in the same traffic jam that killed Henrik, Marco, and Sergei, but from the opposite direction. She couldn't descend because the rope was blocked. She couldn't traverse around because the terrain was too dangerous. She couldn't wait because her body was already depleted from the summit push. So she started helping. Christine spent those 3 hours providing medical assistance to climbers who were showing symptoms of altitude sickness. She administered injections from her personal medical kit. She performed field assessments. She told at least 4 people that they needed to turn around immediately or they would die. None of them listened. They'd come too far. They'd spent too much money. They couldn't turn back now. At 5:30 p.m., Christine finally broke through the traffic and began her descent toward Camp 4. By then, she'd been above 500 meters for nearly 18 hours, far beyond the safe limit for human survival at that altitude. Her body was consuming itself for fuel. Her blood was thickening from dehydration. Her brain was beginning to swell. She collapsed at 7 p.m., approximately 300 meters from camp. Other climbers saw her fall. They didn't stop. Christine's body was recovered 2 days later. The medical examiner's report attributed her death to, quote, exhaustion and exposure secondary to prolonged high-altitude exposure. But everyone who knows the story understands what really killed her: the hours she spent trying to save people who refused to be saved, while the system that put them all in danger churned forward without hesitation. That was who died on July 15, 2006. 9 human beings with families, careers, dreams, and futures. All of them killed by a disaster that was created, step by step, decision by decision, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The question now is, who made those decisions? And why? Chapter 3. Fatal Decisions and Escalation. The permit office in Islamabad isn't a dramatic building. It's a government ministry. Fluorescent lights, metal filing cabinets, bureaucrats in short-sleeved shirts stamping documents and processing fees. Nothing about it suggests that decisions made there could kill people on a mountain 2,000 kilometers away. But in March 2006, that's exactly what happened. The official who approved the 219 permits for Gasherbrum 2 was a mid-level functionary named Hassan Sharif. He'd been working in the Ministry of Tourism for 11 years. He processed climbing permits, trekking permits, wildlife permits, paperwork that crossed his desk in an endless stream and required nothing more than verification of payment and documentation. When the applications for summer 2006 started arriving, Sharif noticed the volume immediately. By mid-February, he'd already received more permit requests for Gasherbrum 2 than the previous 3 seasons combined. By early March, the number had surpassed any single peak record in Pakistani mountaineering history. Sharif flagged the issue to his supervisor. He wrote a memo suggesting that the ministry consider implementing permit caps to prevent overcrowding. He attached data from the 2004 season, when 87 permits had created traffic issues that expedition leaders had formally complained about. His supervisor thanked him for the memo and told him to approve all applications as submitted. The revenue was too significant to turn away. The minister had specifically requested that climbing tourism be maximized in 2006 to offset budget shortfalls elsewhere. Sharif approved the permits, all 219 of them. He told a Pakistani journalist in 2017, 11 years after the disaster, that he'd known it was dangerous. "I wrote the memo," he said. "I explained the risks. They didn't want to hear it. They wanted the money." When asked if he felt responsible for the deaths, Sharif was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I pushed a stamp. The people who ignored the warning are responsible. The people who sent climbers into that situation are responsible. I was just a bureaucrat." He's not wrong, but he's not entirely right either. Because the permit approval was just the first link in a chain of decisions that required dozens of people to stay silent, to look the other way, to prioritize revenue over safety at every single step. The expedition companies were the next link. By April 2006, every major commercial operator in the Karakoram knew how many climbers would be on Gasherbrum 2 that summer. The permit lists were circulated among liaison officers. Base camp logistics were coordinated through the Pakistani Alpine Club. There was no secret about what was coming. And the expedition companies did nothing. They didn't warn their clients, they didn't stagger their summit attempts. They didn't coordinate departure times to reduce traffic on the fixed ropes. They didn't install additional fixed lines on the bottleneck section. They didn't hire extra Sherpas to manage the flow. They just kept taking bookings, kept collecting deposits, kept promising their clients that Gasherbrum 2 was a straightforward 8,000-meter peak with manageable technical challenges. Let me tell you exactly how that silence worked, because the mechanics of commercial mountaineering are designed to suppress safety concerns at every level. Commercial expeditions are businesses. Their clients pay between $8,000 and $30,000 for spots on guided climbs, and that money flows through a competitive marketplace where success rates are the primary selling point. If you're a potential client researching expeditions, what do you look for? You look at summit success rates. You look at client testimonials. You look at social media posts showing smiling climbers on top of famous peaks. You don't look at safety records, because safety data isn't published anywhere accessible. You don't look at near misses, because expedition companies don't report them. You don't look at deaths per attempt, because calculating that number requires information that the industry actively suppresses. So expedition companies compete on success rates. And success rates go up when you push clients harder, cut corners on safety margins, and gamble with weather windows that more cautious operators would avoid. In 2006, the commercial operators on Gasherbrum 2 faced a choice. They could acknowledge the crowding problem, stagger their summit attempts across multiple days, and accept lower success rates as the trade-off for safety. Or they could ignore the problem, send all their clients up on the same perfect weather day, and hope that the traffic would somehow work itself out. Every single company chose option 2. Franco Cavalli, the Italian guide whose client Marco Benedetti died in the bottleneck, departed for the summit at 3 a.m. on July 15th with his entire team of 8 clients. He knew other expeditions were departing at the same time. He'd seen the fixed rope traffic during the acclimatization rotation the previous week. He calculated the odds and decided they were acceptable. When asked later why he didn't stagger his team's departure or choose a different summit day, Cavalli said, "The weather window was limited. If I'd waited, my clients might not have summited at all. That's what they paid me for." Alexei Petrov, the Kazakh operator who'd oversold his expedition and brought 12 clients instead of 6, made the same calculation. He departed at 3:30 a.m. with all 12 climbers moving in a single group, knowing they would move slowly, knowing they would create delays for everyone behind them. When asked why he didn't split his group into smaller teams with staggered departures, Petrov said, "I didn't have enough guides to support multiple summit pushes. The clients would have had to choose who went first. That wasn't fair." What he didn't say was that he'd hired the minimum number of guides required by Pakistani regulations, 3 for 12 clients, because hiring more would have cut into his profit margin. If you're following this story and you're feeling the weight of these decisions, the accumulation of negligence, the calculated risks with other people's lives, then you understand why this channel exists. We document these patterns because they repeat. The same failures that killed people in 2006 are still operating today, on different mountains, with different victims. Subscribe if you want to see those investigations too. Now, let me take you to the morning of July 15, 2006, and show you exactly how those decisions became deaths. The first climbers departed Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on July 14th. These were small, independent teams, mostly European climbers who'd done their research and understood that early departure meant avoiding traffic. By midnight, the commercial expeditions were mobilizing. Lights flickered across the tents as guides woke their clients, checked equipment, and distributed hot drinks. The air was cold but still. The stars were brilliant overhead. Everything looked perfect. At 2 a.m., the mass exodus began. More than 100 climbers left Camp 4 within a 90-minute window, all of them heading for the same route, the same fixed ropes, the same summit. The first indication of trouble came at 5:30 a.m., when the lead climbers reached the Banana Ridge, the narrow traverse section at 600 meters, where the route narrows to a single track along an exposed ridge with 1,000-meter drops on either side. The fixed ropes on the Banana Ridge were designed for one-way traffic. During normal seasons, climbers ascended in the morning and descended in the afternoon, rarely crossing paths. The rope could accommodate perhaps 10 to 15 climbers at a time, without significant delays. On July 15th, there were already 40 climbers on the ridge by 6 a.m., and more arriving every few minutes. By 7 a.m., the queue had begun. The Banana Ridge traverse normally takes 60 to 90 minutes. For the climbers who reached it early, passage was straightforward. For those who arrived after 6:30 a.m., the traverse became a waiting game. Every climber had to clip onto the fixed rope to cross safely. Every climber had to unclip and reclip at each anchor point. Every delay, a slow climber, a frozen carabiner, a moment of confusion, propagated backward through the line like a traffic jam on a highway. By 8 a.m., climbers at the back of the queue were waiting more than an hour just to reach the start of the traverse. By 9 a.m., that wait had stretched to 2 hours. By 10 a.m., some climbers had been standing stationary on the exposed ridge for 3 hours or more. Standing still at 600 meters is not like standing still at sea level. Your body is burning calories at an enormous rate just to maintain core temperature. Your cells are starving for oxygen. Your blood is thickening because you can't stay hydrated in the dry, frigid air. Every minute you wait is a minute closer to the point where your body simply cannot sustain itself. And the climbing continued. Climbers kept arriving at the bottom of the queue. Climbers at the front kept pushing upward. No one turned back. No one coordinated. No one made the decision that could have saved lives. By 11 a.m., the first signs of physiological breakdown were appearing throughout the queue. Climbers were stumbling. Climbers were sitting down when they should have been moving. Climbers were showing the early symptoms of hypothermia, confusion, slurred speech, loss of coordination. Henrik Larsson was one of them. The Swedish engineer who'd promised his wife this would be his last expedition was standing near the middle of the queue, watching the traffic ahead of him barely move, feeling his body temperature drop degree by degree. He radioed his expedition leader at base camp. The conversation was recorded. "I've been waiting for nearly 2 hours," Henrik said. "Should I turn back?" The expedition leader, a Norwegian named Erik Olsen, who'd organized Henrik's independent expedition, told him to hold his position. "The traffic will clear soon," Olsen said. "You're almost through the hard part. Just wait a little longer." Henrik waited. At 3:30 p.m., his body gave out. He died standing in line, still clipped to the rope, his hands frozen to his ice axe. Erik Olsen is still running expeditions. He's never publicly acknowledged that radio call. But a recording of it was leaked to a Swedish climbing forum in 2012, and Henrik's widow Ingrid has confirmed its authenticity. She sued Olsen in Norwegian courts in 2015. The case was dismissed on jurisdictional grounds. The death occurred in Pakistan, where the Norwegian court had no authority. Ingrid was left with a recording of her husband's voice asking for guidance and receiving reassurance that killed him. Let me tell you about another conversation that happened that morning, one that reveals how far the denial extended. At 9 a.m., a climber named Thomas Roth reached the top of the Banana Ridge after waiting more than 2 hours in the queue. He was German, experienced, and deeply concerned about what he'd witnessed during the wait. Instead of continuing toward the summit, Roth stopped at a relatively flat section of the ridge and started photographing the traffic below him. He counted 47 climbers visible on the traverse, a number he'd never seen on any 8,000-meter peak in his 20 years of climbing. He radioed his base camp with a warning. "This is going to get people killed," he said. "Someone needs to tell the other expeditions to turn around." His expedition leader, a German operator named Klaus Weber, told Roth that he'd relay the message. 20 minutes later, Weber called back and said he'd contacted 3 other expedition leaders at base camp. None of them were willing to order their climbers to descend. "They said their clients have paid too much to turn back now," Weber told Roth. "They said the traffic will clear." Roth continued to the summit. He made it down safely that night, passing multiple bodies on his descent. He wrote a detailed account of what he'd witnessed for a German climbing magazine, which published it in September 2006. The article named names. It quoted conversations. It directly accused specific expedition companies of negligence that contributed to multiple deaths. Within weeks, Roth received legal threats from 4 expedition operators. The magazine received advertising boycotts from climbing equipment manufacturers who didn't want to be associated with the controversy. The article was removed from the magazine's website. Roth never wrote about the disaster again. That's how the climbing industry handles accountability. Silence. Threats. Economic pressure. The deaths happen. The investigations don't. But the traffic jam wasn't the only factor that killed people on July 15th. The queue created the conditions for death, but the deaths themselves happened because of decisions made in the hours that followed. Decisions about whether to help, whether to rescue, whether to prioritize summit ambitions over human life. Those decisions, and the people who made them, are what I need to tell you about next. Because by 2 p.m. on July 15th, the situation on the Banana Ridge had evolved from dangerous to catastrophic. Climbers were dying, bodies were appearing on the route, and the climbing community faced a choice: stop the ascent and organize rescues, or keep pushing upward and step over the bodies. They chose to keep climbing. Chapter 4. The Catastrophe. At 2:17 p.m. on July 15, 2006, a Dutch climber named Rudy Bakker reached the body of Peter Vanderberg on the Banana Ridge Traverse. Peter was still clipped to the fixed rope. His ice axe was planted in the snow beside him. His body was slumped forward, head resting on his chest, hands frozen inside his mittens. Bakker had known Peter for 7 years. They'd trained together in the Alps. They'd shared meals at base camp just 3 days earlier. Peter had shown Bakker photographs of his pregnant wife and explained how he was going to be a father again in 2 months. Now Peter was dead. Bakker's first instinct was to help. He reached for Peter's harness, thinking he might be able to drag him to a wider section of the ridge where someone could perform CPR. But Peter was frozen to the snow. His down suit had fused with the ice beneath him. Moving him would require equipment and manpower that Bakker didn't have. There was a line of climbers behind Bakker, waiting to pass. They were getting impatient. One of them, an American whose identity has never been confirmed, shouted at Bakker to move. "He's dead," the American said. "You can't help him. Move, or we all die." Bakker moved. He stepped over Peter's body and continued toward the summit. He reached the top at 4:30 p.m., took a photograph, and began his descent. When he passed Peter's body again on the way down, there were 2 more bodies nearby. Kazuki Tanaka had died within the hour. A third climber, identity still disputed, had collapsed approximately 50 meters away. Bakker didn't stop for any of them. He couldn't. The light was fading. His oxygen reserves were critical. If he'd stopped for even 20 minutes, he would have become the 4th body on that section of ridge. He told a Dutch journalist in 2008 that passing Peter's body was the worst moment of his life. "I stepped over my friend," he said. "I left him there. I knew his wife was pregnant. I knew he would never see his child. And I kept climbing." When asked if he regretted not doing more, Bakker was silent for a long time. Then he said, "What more could I do? The mountain was killing everyone who stopped. I had to choose between dying with Peter or living without him." That choice, between dying to help and living with the guilt, was playing out across the entire mountain that afternoon. Climbers were confronting frozen bodies and unresponsive teammates and strangers crying for help, and they were making calculations that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Let me tell you what happened to Emilia Reyes, the Spanish architect whose body was found wearing her engagement ring. Emilia reached the summit at 4:47 p.m., one of the last climbers to do so that day. By the time she signed her name in the summit log and began her descent, the sun was already low on the horizon and the temperature was dropping rapidly. The traffic jam that had slowed the ascent was now reversing. Climbers who had reached the summit late were desperate to descend before darkness fell. Climbers who had turned back earlier were still on the fixed ropes, moving slowly downward. The result was a second traffic jam, this time on the descent route, that was even more dangerous than the first. Amelia reached the top of the Banana Ridge at approximately 6:30 p.m. By then, she'd been above 500 meters for nearly 18 hours. Her body was depleted. Her coordination was failing. She struggled to clip and unclip from the fixed rope anchor points, a task that had been automatic on the ascent. A Sherpa from a commercial expedition saw her stumbling. He approached and asked if she needed help. Amelia said she was fine. She insisted she could make it down on her own. The Sherpa later told investigators that he didn't believe her, that her movements were uncoordinated and her speech was slurred, but that he'd already helped 3 other climbers that afternoon and was exhausted himself. He offered to escort her to Camp 4, but Amelia refused. She said her team was waiting for her. Her team was not waiting for her. Her expedition had descended hours earlier, assuming Amelia was either ahead of them or had turned back. No one had maintained radio contact with her since early afternoon. At approximately 10 p.m., Amelia collapsed 200 meters from Camp 4. Climbers in the tents heard sounds on the ridge, scraping, movement, what might have been a voice, but no one went outside to investigate. The temperature was minus 35 degrees Celsius. The wind was rising. Going outside meant risking hypothermia and frostbite. At dawn on July 16th, a Sherpa preparing for a second summit attempt found Amelia's body. She was lying on her back, arms extended, face turned toward the sky. Her headlamp was still on, battery dead. Her engagement ring was visible on her left hand. The Sherpa marked her position and continued upward. He summited that day without incident. Amelia's body remained where he'd found it for 11 days until a recovery team could reach her. Her fiancé Carlos flew to Pakistan to identify her remains. He brought her wedding dress with him, the one she'd chosen for their ceremony scheduled for September. He left it at base camp. If you've stayed with this story for this long, if you're feeling the weight of these deaths and the failure of every system that could have prevented them, then you understand the value of comprehensive documentation. This is what we do on this channel. We don't look away, we don't simplify, we honor the dead by telling the complete truth. Subscribe if you want more content like this. Share it with someone who needs to understand why commercial mountaineering kills people. Now, let me tell you about the deaths that happened in the darkness. By 7 p.m. on July 15th, the situation on Gasherbrum 2 had evolved from a traffic disaster into a survival crisis. Climbers were scattered across the upper mountain, some still descending, some bivouacking in exposed positions, some dying where they stood. The commercial expeditions had lost track of their clients. Radio communications were fragmentary. Some climbers had working satellite phones, most didn't. Base camp operators were receiving distress calls from multiple directions, often simultaneously, with no way to coordinate rescue efforts. The first organized rescue attempt was launched at 9 p.m. A team of 4 Sherpas from a Korean expedition departed Camp 4 with extra oxygen and emergency supplies. Their goal was to reach climbers who'd been reported as stranded on the upper ridge and escort them back to camp. The Sherpas climbed through the darkness, headlamps cutting thin beams through the frozen air, following the fixed ropes toward the sounds of distress. By midnight, they'd reached the first casualties. Henrik Larsson was dead, Kazuki Tanaka was dead, Peter Vanderberg was dead. A climber later identified as Yuki Hasegawa was dead. Marco Benedetti was dying, still breathing when the Sherpas reached him, but unresponsive and hypothermic beyond recovery. The Sherpas faced an impossible choice: attempt to revive Marco and potentially die themselves in the process, or continue upward to search for survivors who might still be saved. They continued upward. Marco died sometime in the hours that followed. His body was found the next morning, frozen in exactly the position the Sherpas had left him. At approximately 2 a.m. on July 16th, the Sherpa team found 2 climbers still alive, a British man and an Austrian woman who'd bivouacked behind an ice formation and were suffering from severe frostbite but were able to walk with assistance. The Sherpas escorted them back to Camp 4. The descent took 4 hours. Both climbers survived, though the British man lost 3 fingers and 7 toes to frostbite. The Austrian woman lost portions of both ears. By dawn, the scope of the disaster was becoming clear. Expedition leaders at base camp began compiling lists of the missing. Radio calls went out to every camp on the mountain, asking for head counts and status reports. The numbers were devastating. 9 climbers were confirmed dead or missing, and presumed dead. At least 12 more were suffering from serious frostbite or altitude illness. 3 climbers who'd bivouacked at high altitude were still unaccounted for, and the climbing continued. This is the part of the story that most accounts omit, because it reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the mountaineering community. On July 16, 2006, less than 12 hours after 9 people had died on Gasherbrum 2, multiple expeditions launched summit attempts. They climbed past the bodies on the Banana Ridge. They stepped over frozen corpses that were still wearing harnesses and holding ice axes. They signed their names in the same summit log that Amelia Reyes had signed the previous day. Some of them took photographs. The rationale was consistent across every climber who continued that day. The weather window was still open, the fixed ropes were still in place, and they had come too far and spent too much money to turn back because of deaths that had already happened. The dead couldn't be helped. The living could still summit. One German climber, his identity withheld by request, described passing Henrik Larsson's body at approximately 10 a.m. on July 16th. He was frozen to the rope, the climber said. His face was blue. His eyes were open. I had to unclip around him to get past. I looked at him for about 10 seconds. Then I kept climbing. When asked how he justified continuing after passing a dead body, the climber said, "Henrik wasn't coming back, I was. What good would it have done for me to stop?" That logic, the brutal arithmetic of high-altitude survival, was repeated by dozens of climbers in the days following the disaster. They had calculated the costs and benefits. They had weighed their investment against the risks. They had concluded that the dead were irrelevant to their decision-making. And they were right in a purely utilitarian sense. Stopping wouldn't bring anyone back. Descending wouldn't undo what had happened. The only question was whether they would add themselves to the death toll or reach the summit and go home. But there's a different question that the utilitarian calculus ignores. What does it do to a person, to a community, when stepping over bodies becomes acceptable behavior? When the systems that killed 9 people continue operating without pause or accountability? When the official response to a mass casualty event is to keep climbing? That question doesn't have an easy answer. But it's the question that haunted the survivors, the families, and the climbing community for years after the disaster. And it's the question we're going to answer in the next section. When we look at what happened after the bodies were counted, the survivors descended, and the climbing industry began the process of forgetting. Chapter 5. Aftermath and Investigation. The first bodies came down on July 18, 2006, 3 days after the disaster, when weather conditions finally allowed recovery operations to begin. A joint team of Sherpas from multiple expeditions ascended the fixed ropes carrying body bags, satellite phones, and GPS units to mark the locations of remains that couldn't be immediately recovered. They worked in shifts, rotating every 4 hours to prevent exhaustion at altitude. Peter Vanderberg was the first body recovered. His corpse had frozen so solidly to the snow that the recovery team had to chip away the ice around him before he could be moved. The process took nearly 2 hours. By the time they got him into the body bag, 3 other Sherpas had developed early signs of frostbite and had to descend. Peter's body was carried down the mountain over the course of 2 days, passed from team to team at each camp, accumulating a grim escort of climbers who helped with the burden. At base camp, his expedition leader contacted the Dutch embassy in Islamabad to begin the repatriation process. Peter's wife, Marieke, learned of his death from a satellite phone call on July 16th, the day after he died, hours before anyone had confirmed his identity. She was 8 months pregnant. She collapsed when she heard the news and had to be hospitalized for observation. The stress nearly triggered premature labor. She gave birth to their daughter 6 weeks later. She named the child Peter, after her father. Marieke has never spoken publicly about her husband's death, but in 2019, she wrote a letter to a Dutch climbing magazine that had published an anniversary article about the disaster. The letter was never intended for publication. but portions of it were later shared with the magazine's permission. "They tell me he died doing what he loved," Marike wrote. But he didn't love dying. He didn't love leaving his family. He didn't love being stepped over by people who kept climbing after he was gone. What he loved was the mountains. What the mountains did to him was murder. The word murder is legally inaccurate. No one was ever charged with a crime in connection with the 2006 disaster. Pakistani authorities conducted no criminal investigation. No expedition company faced legal consequences. No individual was held accountable for any of the decisions that led to 9 deaths. But Marike's language captures something that the legal framework misses: the sense among families that their loved ones hadn't simply died in an accident, but had been killed by a system that treated their lives as acceptable losses in the pursuit of profit. That sense would grow stronger as the investigation, such as it was, unfolded. The Pakistani Alpine Club conducted the only official inquiry into the disaster. Their report, released in October 2006, was 12 pages long and concluded that the deaths resulted from adverse conditions exacerbated by large numbers of climbers on the route. The report made no recommendations for permit caps. It suggested no changes to the fixed rope system. It assigned no responsibility to expedition companies or individual guides. It mentioned no names except those of the deceased. The climbing industry praised the report for its balanced approach. Families of the dead called it a cover-up. Let me tell you what the official report didn't include: information that was gathered by families, journalists, and independent investigators in the years following the disaster. First, the permit issue. The report acknowledged that 219 permits had been issued for Gasherbrum 2 in 2006, but it didn't investigate how or why that number had been approved. It didn't interview Hassan Sharif, the official who had raised concerns about overcrowding. It didn't examine the internal communications within the Ministry of Tourism that led to the decision to prioritize revenue over safety. Those communications were later obtained by a German journalist named Friedrich Braun, who spent 2 years investigating the disaster for a documentary that was never completed, due to legal threats from the Pakistani government. Braun's files, which were shared with several mountaineering historians before his death in 2018, included emails between ministry officials that explicitly acknowledged the overcrowding risk and dismissed it as unlikely to cause serious problems. One email dated March 12, 2006 read, "We have approved more permits than any previous season." Some expedition leaders have expressed concern about traffic on the route. However, the ministry's priority is maximizing revenue. Safety is the responsibility of individual climbers. That email has never been published. The Pakistani government has never acknowledged its existence. Second, the expedition company failures. The official report treated all expedition companies equally, as if they had all made the same decisions and faced the same constraints. In reality, some companies had behaved far more recklessly than others.